You would have the courage to walk through an icy forest on a forgotten mountain in Siberia, where 9 people disappeared in the snow and were found mutilated, without eyes, without tongues, and without any plausible explanation to this day. This is not an urban legend. This story didn't come out of the head of a horror movie screenwriter. It happened, and we are not talking about centuries ago, but 1959. 9 young people, students, engineers, experienced athletes, entered the snow with backpacks on their backs and maps in their hands, and they were found weeks later in a scene so grotesque that to this day it baffles experts, police, forensic investigators, and the military. They were scattered in the forest, some naked in temperatures of 20 degrees, others with internal fractures impossible to explain, as if they had been crushed by an invisible force. One of them had his skull cracked, another was missing her tongue and eyeballs. There were clothes with radioactivity, footprints that disappeared in the snow, tree with human flesh stuck in the trunk, and a tent, torn from the inside out, as if something had terrified them so much that fleeing without shoes seemed safer than staying inside. The name of this case has spanned decades, theories and secret archives. Dyatlov Pass. A tragedy turned into one of the greatest unsolved real mysteries in modern history. The Soviet Union tried to close the case as death by forces of nature. But what you're going to see today shows that maybe, just maybe, what killed that group wasn't the cold. Some believe in avalanche, others in secret tests of Soviet weapons. There are those who talk about UFOs. And yes, even a Yeti was considered responsible for the horrors of that night. But the truth? The truth is that each new theory only opens up more doubts. It's as if something unnameable is there on that mountain, watching, waiting, ready to hunt. This story is the perfect portrait of what scares us the most, when logic fails, when science is silent, when even the military prefer to lock the documents in a safe. The Dyatlov case is an abyss of questions, a narrative where fear is constant, cold is paralyzing, and death, it is inexplicable. And the most disturbing, it was real. You'll hear names, dates, photos, and details you might rather not know. He will know the victims as people, and not just as bodies. You will see how the frozen despair on the face of each of them still screams for justice. You will understand why this story lives on more than 60 years later. So, get ready to enter a trail where footsteps disappear, where logic melts into the snow, and where time seems frozen on a night that never ended. But I warn you, the deeper you go, the scarier it becomes. What if you discovered that the last thing anyone heard before they died was a muffled scream in the snow, a sound impossible to trace, followed by a silence so deep it seemed to tear through time itself? The Dyatlov case is not just a mystery frozen in Soviet archives. It is an open wound in the hearts of everyone who dares to investigate what really happened that night. And now that you've seen the first signs, it's time to delve deeper into this real nightmare. But get ready. From now on, everything gets even more disturbing. The 10 members of the expedition were ordinary young people. Yes, but with something in common, an almost irrational courage. They were students at the Ural Polytechnic Institute, specializing in engineering, physics, radio, geology. They weren't thrill-seeking amateurs. They had the technical, physical, and mental knowledge to face the harshest environment on Earth. Igor Dyatlov, the leader, was known for his disciplined spirit, fierce determination, and almost military precision in every planning. Every step of the journey had been rigorously documented. Nothing, absolutely nothing, seemed out of control. But what they didn't know is that horror doesn't have to make sense. Fear, when it really hits, destroys any logic. On January 27, 1959, the group set out towards the Ural Mountains, with the goal of reaching the peak of Mount Otorten. The path was inhospitable, covered in heavy snow, dense forests, and almost invisible trails. But the group seemed calm. They took pictures, laughed, wrote in their diaries. Even the cold of 20 degrees C seemed part of the adventure. But already in the first days, an obstacle presented itself. Yuri Yudin, the 10th member, was forced to abandon the expedition because of back pain. Little did he know that this discomfort was, in fact, a life sentence. When saying goodbye to his colleagues, Yuri would never imagine that he would see all of them for the last time. From that point on, the group continued with 9 people. On February 1st, they set up camp on the side of a mountain known to the Mansi natives as Kholat Shakhol, which literally means Mountain of Death. Why did they choose to camp there? Exposed to the biting wind instead of going down into the forest and taking better shelter? Maybe they were tired. Perhaps they underestimated the climate. Or maybe something else had led them to that particular point. A point where logic disappears and terror begins. After that, silence. A silence that lasted for weeks. The group was supposed to return to the village of Vijay around February 12th and send a telegram to the family. When no communication was received, parents and friends began to panic, and rightly so. A rescue task force was organized, and on February 20th, the first volunteers began searching for traces of the young men, but no one expected what was about to be found. 6 days later, a military plane spotted something strange in the snow. It was the group's tent, and what it revealed defied any rational explanation. The tarp was torn, but not on the outside. All cuts were made from the inside out, as if something, or someone, had created so much panic that they preferred to cut their way through with knives, tearing up their own shelter, than using the normal exit. This, in itself, would be scary, but it was just the beginning. Inside the tent, the belongings were all there. Backpacks, clothes, shoes, ski equipment, cameras, but no body. Outside, footprints, barefoot or with socks, some with only one shoe. The marks led to the nearby forest, where a new scene of horror awaited investigators. There, under a tree, were the first two bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonishenko. They were only in their underwear, covered in a thin layer of snow and branches. The hands, totally torn apart, as if they had tried to climb the tree with desperation or pull out branches with brutal force. There were pieces of skin and flesh stuck in the torso, as if in the last seconds of their lives, they had fought against something invisible. Later, investigators found the body of Igor Dyatlov, lying on his back, one hand holding a branch, the other covering his face, as if trying to protect himself from an attack. Nearby, Zenaida Kolmogorova and Rustem Slobodin, both killed in positions that suggest a desperate attempt to return to the tent. Slobodin had a deep head injury, but with no signs of external struggle, no scratches, just broken bones, as if he had been hit by an invisible force, a force impossible to explain. The other four members were only found in May, after the thaw. Their bodies lay in a ravine, partially buried by snow, and what was revealed there shocked even the coroners. Ludmila Dubinina had her chest crushed so hard that several ribs were broken. She was tongueless, no eyes, no part of the skin on the face, and according to experts, without any sign of animal attack. Alexander Kolovatov had his nose crushed and his neck twisted in an unusual way. Semyon Zolotaryov, the oldest of the group, had his chest compressed with a force equivalent to a car accident, but his skin showed no cuts. The trauma was internal, almost surgical. None of the wounds matched the natural setting. There were no large stones. There were no traces of an avalanche. And yet, the bodies were mutilated, as if the mountain itself had crushed their chests, as if an invisible entity had applied pressure directly to his bones. Some of the clothing featured alarming levels of radiation. That's right, radiation. And no one ever explained why, nor how, nor where it came from. With each detail revealed, the case sank deeper into dark territory. And it increasingly seemed that it was not just a tragedy of ill-prepared mountaineers. It was something more, something forbidden, something that perhaps should never have been told. The Soviet government quickly closed the case. He claimed that the cause of death was an unknown natural force, but Yuri Yudin himself, the only survivor, has spent his entire life questioning this official version. He believed, with all his might, that something had been hidden, something that should never have happened. And the mysteries kept emerging. Incomplete reports, missing photographs, cameras that were in the tent, but whose negatives are gone, diaries that simply evaporated, documents that contained dates of investigation, even before the disappearance was officially recognized. And perhaps most disturbingly, objects found in the tent that did not belong to any of the members. One of them was a pair of military glasses. The other, a kind of leg band worn by soldiers of War II. None of them were identified. None of them should be there. Then the question continues, like a wound that never heals. What really happened on that frozen hillside? What kind of terror made 9 healthy and trained young people go barefoot in the middle of the blizzard? What caused such brutal internal wounds, with no sign of external attack? And the most enigmatic, who or what was there that night? Because what we are going to see next are the theories. Theories so disturbing that they seem to come out of horror movies, but which, within this scenario, make more sense than the official explanation. Get ready to enter a terrain where the real and the supernatural mix, where military conspiracies, Unexplained phenomena and forces beyond logic intersect in a deadly dance. They said it was an avalanche. And this is where everything starts to fall apart. If it was really an avalanche, how to explain that the tent was still partially assembled? How to justify that the bodies were scattered in different parts of the forest and not buried by snow? How can we accept that some had severe internal fractures, as if they had been crushed by tons of pressure, while others had no visible scratches at all? The avalanche theory collapses as soon as you look closely at the details, because even snow experts have claimed that the geographical conditions of Death Mountain did not favor the necessary accumulation of snow to trigger an avalanche at that exact point. In addition, the group's own records did not indicate concern about imminent risk. No alerts, no fear. Others have tried to suggest that the group may have suffered a collective case of food poisoning or even hallucinations caused by carbon monoxide poisoning. But again, why tear up the tent from the inside? Why go running naked in lethal temperatures? And even more, if it were something related to intoxication, how to explain the fractures in the bones, the absence of the tongue, the radioactivity in the clothes? None of this fits. None of this holds up. The extreme cold theory, as logical as it may seem, also stumbles over the details. Yes, hypothermia can cause mental confusion and even lead a person to remove their clothes, a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing. But what about injuries and the organization of the group's actions? Climbing trees, building fires, trying to come back. These attitudes require reasoning, strategy, physical endurance. They do not match a terminal state of confusion caused by frostbite. So, if nature doesn't explain it, what else could? This is where we dive into the possibilities that many prefer to avoid. Local legends speak of mountain spirits. The Mansi, the indigenous people who inhabit the region, treat Kholat Shachal as sacred ground, inhabited by ancestral entities that punish those who invade their territory. According to ancient accounts, 9 hunters of the tribe died there under mysterious circumstances, just like the young men of Dyatlov. No visible injuries, no clear natural causes, only dead as if the air had been ripped from them. For the Mansi, these deaths are no coincidence. These are warnings, signs that something inhuman protects that land. But if you think this already sounds like a supernatural movie script, wait. One of the most bizarre and yet most repeated theories is that of the Yeti. Yes, the legendary snowy creature, the man of the mountains, the monster that, according to some theorists, would inhabit remote and icy regions, attacking those who dare to cross its path. And amazingly, among the photos recovered from the young people's camera, there is an image that shows a human figure at the bottom of the forest. Elongated shadow, strange proportion. None of the members admitted to taking that photo, and none recognized the figure. It was there, registered. The image went viral, even inspiring horror movies. Would he be a member of the group, a solo traveler, or something that shouldn't have been seen? The story begins to darken even more when we enter the realm of lights in the sky. Other nearby expeditions reported seeing orange spheres that same night crossing the skies over the Ural Mountains. The same lights appear as incandescent spots in one of the group's last photos. Coincidence? Atmospheric phenomenon? Or contact with something much deeper? Theorists suggest that the youngsters would have witnessed a craft, or worse, come into contact with some extraterrestrial force. This would explain the sudden panic, the escape, the unexplained injuries, radioactivity, and above all, the silence that followed. But among all the explanations, one stands out for its calculated coldness: the theory of the secret military operation. The Ural Mountains were, at that time, the scene of experimental tests with chemical weapons, missiles, prototype airplanes. There are records that indicate that the Soviet government used isolated regions as a living laboratory. So imagine, what if the group had camped, without knowing it, exactly where a secret test would take place? An explosion, a gas, a shockwave, a frequency of sound, some unknown technology. This would justify the internal traumas, the bodies thrown in different directions, the urgency to flee. And it would also explain why some bodies show signs of radiation. Yuri Yudin himself, the only survivor, revealed years later that during the process of recognizing the belongings of his colleagues, he saw objects that had never belonged to any of them: military glasses, a strange fabric, and, most alarmingly, a piece that looked like part of a uniform worn by concentration camp prisoners. This led him to believe that military personnel had been at the scene, maybe before everything happens, maybe later, to cover up. And then we come to the darkest of hypotheses, that one of the members of the expedition was, in fact, an undercover KGB agent. According to some records, Semyon Zolotaryov, the eldest of the group, used a false name. He had military experience. He received medals for bravery. He was too experienced to be there by chance. Theorists say he would be on a mission to deliver information to Western contacts, disguised among the students. But something went wrong. Someone found out. The entire group was eliminated to avoid leaks, not because of what they saw, but because of who they were with. And at that point, everything becomes even more sinister. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, part of the files on the case were released, but incomplete. Many documents have disappeared. Some excerpts were censored, crossed out. Witnesses contradicted one another. Important data, such as autopsy reports, were missing, and the official justification remained the same: death caused by an unknown natural force. But what about you? So far, which of these theories seems more plausible? Write in the comments. It was the army. It was the aliens. It was something we can't explain. Do you think it was a covert military mistake? An attack by an unknown creature? A supernatural phenomenon? Or a conspiracy so well elaborated that even today it prevents us from knowing the truth? Because regardless of which theory you choose to believe, one thing is certain: 9 young people have stepped into the snow, and what happened to them is far from a simple accident. And the scariest thing is that perhaps whatever happened may happen again, because this mystery is still alive. Even after decades, nothing has been resolved. With each new investigation, the case seems more like a labyrinth, with no end, no logic, no clear way out. A spiral of questions that drags you deeper. And if you've come this far, it's because you're also trying to make some sense of it all. But how to make sense of something that, from the beginning, refuses to be explained? Let's recap. 9 extremely prepared young people, experienced in trails, facing brutal conditions, are found dead in ways that science to this day cannot clearly describe. Some of them had their breasts crushed without external marks. Others were naked, barefoot, in the middle of the forest, with their hands raw as if they had fought their own despair. One of them had his tongue torn out. Another was missing his eyes. And no, they weren't animals. The reports made this clear. And what about the tent torn inside? Of people fleeing in a line, leaving footprints in the snow? Footprints that stopped at nothing? Or the clothes with radiation? What about objects that didn't belong to anyone? The military glasses? The fabric strip? The coded tattoo? The files crossed out? The camera that disappeared? The negatives destroyed? The diaries that mysteriously disappear from the official records? None of this seems accidental. None of this sounds like a simple error of judgment by an inexperienced group. Have you ever stopped to think about the level of panic someone needs to feel to run barefoot in a 30-degree blizzard, knowing that it will freeze in a few minutes? What did they see? What did they hear? What was in that tent that made 9 trained people tear up their own exit and run into the forest as if they were being hunted? And the scariest thing of all is that these questions are not just rhetorical. They continue to echo in every corner of the community of investigators, of enthusiasts of unsolved cases, of lovers of real horror stories. Because the Dyatlov case is a minefield for those who try to put the pieces together. You step on one theory and another explodes. You think you're close to the answer, and you find that yet another file has been deleted. Another witness died. One more piece of data has disappeared. The Soviet government said it was a force of nature. But what kind of natural force plucks out a victim's eyes and tongue without leaving external marks? What natural force causes bodies to be thrown so violently that the internal organs rupture without visible scratches? What weather phenomenon explains signs of radiation in the clothes of young university students? And more, why did the Soviet Union immediately close the area after the bodies were found? Why were the first to arrive on the scene soldiers and not civilians? Why did Yuri Yudin, the sole survivor, always claim that there were hidden lies? Why did he say that objects found in the tent did not belong to anyone in the group? Who was with them on that mountain? Do you realize how wrong everything is? How does each piece of this story defy any reasonable explanation? Theories vary between the supernatural and the scientific, between the logical and the absurd, but none can handle everything. None answers every detail. Each explanation seems to be just one piece of the puzzle, while the full picture remains invisible. And it is in this invisible that real terror lives. Because what really scares us is not blood. It's not the photos. It's not the snow or, the bodies. What freezes the spine is what we can't name. That which escapes from the light, which lives in the gaps. It is the silence of the reports, the blank stare of the officers, the rush to close the case, forced oblivion. There's something on that mountain, something they saw, something that shouldn't be there, something that is not part of our world, or maybe it does. But it's been hidden for longer than we can imagine, and this is not just an assumption. There are 60 years of lies, conflicting versions, disappearances, and documents with grotesque gaps. Why such insistence on hiding the truth? Perhaps the group was the victim of a military test. Perhaps he entered an area by chance that was being monitored by some secret experiment. Perhaps you have witnessed something that you should not. Maybe someone followed them. We may never know. But what matters is that the fear they felt, it was real. And if you doubt it, look again at the details. A tent torn from the inside. Out, bodies scattered in calculated distances, torn clothes, signs of desperate struggle, and eyes that never saw again. And so, now that you know all this, what do you think? Do you still believe the official version? You think it was really the fury of nature? Or is there something that the government has never told? Why did only one person lose their tongue? Why did they run away without even putting on their shoes? What caused internal traumas in bodies without external marks? What caused the radiation? Why did documents disappear? Comment below on your theory. He writes, I think it was the government, or it was something supernatural, or even, this will never be explained. Write what you believe, because perhaps among the comments, there is an answer that no one has thought of yet. And if you think this was the most bizarre case you've ever heard, just wait until you know what happened in Hinterkaifeck, a brutal crime on an isolated farm where the darkness itself seemed to breathe on the walls. But this story is for another video.